His own work was exhibited last year in the Caracas Museum of Contemporary Arts. And he is associate professor in the Universidad Simon Bolivar. He has been a visiting critic in Syracuse University, Cornell, the University of Miami, and in Buenos Aires. Tonight's lecture will be about Carlos Raul Villanueva, the most influential of Venezuelan modern architects. A figure that has gone in recent years from great neglection to maybe overloaded mystification. In this context, I think that the analysis of Larranaga engenders a fresh reading of Villanueva's work. I would also like to thank Mohsen Mustafavi, the chairman of the Architectural Association, for supporting this project from the beginning, and of course Andrew Mackenzie from making the exhibition be there. So please join me in welcoming Enrique Larranaga. Thank you.
Thank you. This morning I attended in this very room a presentation on the architectural material that Britain is bringing to Venice for the Biennale. Some of you might know Venezuela means Little Venice. I do not believe in coincidences. As Milan Kundera says in The Unbearable Lightness of Being, a coincidence is just an opportunity given by life for unfolding the beauty of what the blind or the stupid call accidents. So this coincidence of having me here in Britain, bringing some example of architecture from Little Venice in the room where the architecture from Britain being brought to Venice was shown, being brought to Venice, the city that brought its name to my country, I think is a good sign of beauty. And so I hope. Although I know that it might be slightly boring, I rather read what I'm going to say. That's for two reasons. First, because of my not very good English, which for some of you, what might be even worse is that it has an American accent. And basically because of that, for being sure that I say what I thought I was going to say. So I'll start reading, and I might stop and make some comments. I think it's only fair for me to begin these words by saying that I'm not a historian nor a theoretician. I'm just an architect, a practicing architect who teaches. That is, I am a professional who's also a professor, which I believe ends up being the same, one who professes architecture in my case. It is with these lenses that I have approached the work of Carlos Raul Villanueva at Ciudad Universitaria de Caracas. I became particularly interested in these buildings because of a competition for the law school on campus, which I won in 1986. As if any proof on the faith needed for professing this hope creates always a will for the possible, I can say that after 14 years, 4 deans, and so many changes that the original proposal is no longer valid, I might hopefully begin the final project for this building sometime next month. Forced by the competition and its results, I studied Villanueva, something that surprisingly I had not been asked to do during my time as a student, which had ended just a few years before. And I had to do it on my own, live and direct, and for myself, which I think was fortunate, because it allowed me to approach these buildings not with the hesitant distance of an assignment, but with the intellectual proximity of someone who picks a text he wants to read, and in it chooses some chapters and decides to skip some others. I started these buildings not for answering anything to anyone, but for helping me understand my own questions, only to find out that the process became more joyful and more useful as it strongly questioned what I thought I had understood. Through these words, besides curious facts and nice images, which you'll find more accurately documented in books you might check if I succeed in raising your interest, I want to share some of those questions with you as an evidence of the necessary permanence of doubt on both sides of the ocean, and hopefully to encourage those from you which will follow. And I start the talk itself with a quote from Octavio Paz. It is difficult to define what we are, but our works speak for us. The more than 70 buildings that Carlos Raul Villanueva designed and built for Ciudad Universitaria de Caracas between 1945 and 1962, still the substantial body of this institution, grant the visitor the rare opportunity of experiencing place through a single author's architectural sense. The consistent quality of so many pieces built in such a short period of time, at the very hectic pace of 3 or 4 or 5 buildings a year, and the coherence with which tasks, scales, and activities so diverse were developed, add admiration to the initial surprise. But the most remarkable characteristic of this unique process, the most pedagogical one and its most intriguing offer, is the intelligent intensity with which Villanueva ably transformed a monumental commission into a field of investigation. Transforming experimentation into the guiding hand of experience, and with remarkable intellectual freedom and accuracy, notions were confronted and paradigms were questioned along the execution of buildings. As these were added to campus, the building process wrote, edited, rewrote, erased, translated, transposed, deleted, and transcended an architectural text as widely, as surprisingly, as the discipline it was trying to unfold. Walking the spaces of Ciudad Universitaria de Caracas becomes a journey along the mind of the architect, an opportunity to attend to the vivid realization, both as construction and as awareness, of a properly architectural thought in Venezuelan architecture in the 1950s, as well as of quests fundamental to modern architecture through the realization of Villanueva's own architectural thesis. From the original master plan from 1943 on your right, on the left of your right, to the last building by Villanueva on campus, School of Economics from 1962. I didn't bring any photographs from this building because I think it's pretty bad. Unfortunately, you won't be able to see it published because most people think it's not very good, so it hasn't been included in any book. It might be included perhaps in the book that is supposed to be published sometime by Birkhausen and Princeton Architectural Press, basically because that book is written by Villanueva's daughter, so she might think it's not that bad. And along the many changes, erasures, and reformulations in between, these 500 hectares contain the reflections and contradictions of a man formed at the École des Beaux-Arts who became a continental symbol of iconoclastic modernism, of someone who, with the patronage of a ferocious dictatorship, built in Plaza Cubierta the most inspiring monument to the open ambiguities of freedom, of an observer who, born in London and educated in Europe, came to decipher the tropics so accurately that it is now difficult to think of the place without the architecture that so intensely helped us to understand it. Villanueva, that's him and that's his house. Villanueva arrived in Venezuela for the first time in 1929, with hardly any Spanish and having only a vague and distant notion of the territory his parents came from. Son of a diplomat at the time stationed in London, he had been born in 1900 and stayed in Europe for the first 3 decades of his life. After graduating with honors from the École des Beaux-Arts, he decided to go to Venezuela, then touched by the booming light of oil prosperity, and hence full of opportunities for a young architect, but certainly unused to the refinements of high architecture. The political connections of his family soon granted him public commissions in which he displayed the eclectic skills gained in his education with a free sense of monumentality. From the Moorish quotes of Maracai's bull ring on your right from 1930, or the classical solidity of Caracas Fine Art Museum complex from 1936, flamboyant styles playfully and effectively decorated highly formalized buildings. His marriage in 1932 to Margot Villanueva, daughter of a successful developer, connects him to the network of speculative architecture, which allows him to build many, while unremarkable, houses for the suburbs, each dressed in a different style with the accidental frivolity of the nouveau riche these houses were built for. The stark modernity of the first house he built for himself in 1934 in one of the new subdivisions developed by his father-in-law demonstrates his awareness of new tendencies seldom shown in his architecture of the times, at least until Escuela Gran Colombia, on your left, from 1939, and even in this project, certainly more independent from classical canons and related to the fluid naval allusions of early modernism, the break with the official manners is still minor and hardly revolutionary. In any case, and even perhaps because of this unthreatening sense of novelty, the expertise and credibility gained through these works had him as a referential figure by the early 1940s. The importance of Venezuela as oil supplier during World War II and the benefits of political stability generated a period of physical and economical growth that duplicated the population of Caracas in less than 20 years. Building by young architects also formed in France and by some European architects who had come to Venezuela because of the wars, slowly introduced modernity and, more importantly, a sense of cosmopolitan urbanity into the modest town whose traditional and tight grid had remained untouched for more than 400 years. The first major urban renewal operation in Caracas was to be executed by Villanueva in 1942 in El Silencio housing project. Loosely following the compositional guidelines of French architect Maurice Rotival's urban design plan from 1939, El Silencio transformed a dilapidated area into a model for the new urbanity. Basically, it was taking the idea of a monumental axis, this Eje Avenida Bolívar, Bolivar Avenue axis, from Rotival's plan. Clearly defined streets, aligned by commercial galleries, define a pattern of urban spaces that capture the main axis of Rotival's proposal and articulated it to the diagonal avenues leading to the surrounding areas. Galleries and portals explicitly incorporated imagery from local architecture. The arrangement of masses around the block generated a system of semi-private spaces, recalling the inner court around which traditional houses are organized. On these courts, on your left, a more modern, almost accidental architecture sets the inner layer of a reality that appears more formal, on your right, when a city is still resilient to the advances of change and the risks of growth. Managed as a joint venture between federal government and private investors, developed as an urban intervention by means of architectural instruments, and wisely incorporating a sense of modernity without menacing traditional convictions, El Silencio gained credibility for the work of Carlos Raul Villanueva, who was recognized as a skillful architect with proven expertise in the new urban scale. These credentials granted him the commission for the master plan of Ciudad Universitaria de Caracas in 1942. The new campus for the more than 200 years old university was to be located on a field on the then easternmost end of town, surrounded by hills on the west and south, and slowly going down towards small rivers on its north and east edges. The openness of the site, the abundance of resources, and the need to, through this and other projects, state the new economical and political conditions, called for ideas about what the new environment should be. This intensely modern will to define history in terms of ideals stayed with Villanueva for the following years and amidst the many social and political changes along them. In fact, and although these changes seem not to affect Villanueva's capacity for getting jobs, his years as an architect were marked by very unstable political times. In 1944, with Isaías Medina Angarita as president and enjoying particularly good economical times, Venezuela was in the process towards complete democracy. But a coup d'etat in 1945 threw Medina Angarita out. The junta resulting from that coup organized the first openly democratic elections, which took place in 1947, when writer Rómulo Gallegos was elected president. In 1948, Gallegos was taken out of office by another military coup, which, after difficulties among the members of the original junta, led to the dictatorship of Marcos Pérez Jiménez, which governed the country until 1958. The process which started that year set a formal democracy that to this day, and amidst new political difficulties, has prevailed in Venezuela. With committed accuracy and informed curiosity, from the armature of the acquired skills and towards the complexities of the pursued knowledge, Villanueva's process and his architecture became investigative instruments in a quest into the nature and purpose of things that were to express what the world should be. Strongly influenced by Leopoldo Roder's proposal for Bogotá's main campus, the 1944 Master Plan for Ciudad Universitaria de Caracas clearly manifests the principles of Villanueva's Beaux-Arts training. A monumental oval defines the complex as an entity and against the irregularities of the site. The main compositional axis runs from northeast to southwest. Between the sports complex on your right end of that image, that's it, to the university hospital. In its development, this axis organizes university life between the opposing forces of sports and hospital, likely a metaphor for the presence of knowledge and growth between the revealing clashing of strength and weakness, life and death, vitality and sickness, north and south, sunrise and sunset. In the tradition of American campuses and with refined academic tools, the space along the axis is defined by masses displayed to articulate a well-defined open room, stating the power of human will on the fortuity of natural wilderness. With minor adaptations, the principles of this master plan would prevail for the first years into the process and inform the first buildings. To this day, and all through its process, its armature marks Ciudad Universitaria de Caracas as a persistent pentimento, continuously and sometimes conflictingly supporting and contradicting the actual experience of place as traces of the original composition, of the original compositional will that appear and dissolve as the final reality states its own presence. The first building to be erected was the University Hospital, completed in 1945. From the scheme proposed by the American company supplying all the equipment for the hospital, Villanueva developed a pretty massive building set against the mountains framing the site and arranged as a set of interlocked bars generating chords and nodes. 4 of these bars emerged from the basic mass and onto the main field, with a somewhat modern vocabulary that might recall Terragni's Novo Commun and Mendelssohn's Universe Cinema, but decisively stating the symmetry of the building as the referential origin of the axiality of campus. Despite the delicate balcony surrounding the patient's wings, and even the color interventions commissioned some years later by Villanueva to Mateo Manaure, a Venezuelan painter, the university hospital is a piece of academic architecture. Following a traditional understanding of buildings, its frontality, its density, its weight, and very especially its presentation as an object set on the field and against the landscape, allow for the preconceived armature to be seen. All its compositional clues insist on the symmetry of the overall plan and on its monumental stasis, reinforced by the trident of the Tropical Medicine and Anatomical Institute buildings, which, recalling Michelangelo's Campidoglio, scenographically articulate the hospital to the main body of campus. Through the original master plan and the first buildings, and as a metaphor of what architecture could and should do for transforming the modest town into a modern times capital, Villanueva poses the city in academically correct terms, proposing urban grandeur as a symbol of culture and this as an instrument of development. In 1949, Villanueva starts working on the sports complex, built as originally planned on the other end of campus and completed by 1951. A better orientation of the activities suggested a subtle shifting of the alignment that slightly breaks the rigidity of the plan's symmetry. But this compositional adjustment is widely surpassed by the conceptual change in the purpose and instruments of architecture and of its sense of formal appropriateness Villanueva would realize through these buildings and thus incorporate to the process and buildings afterwards. After the influence of Pierluigi Nervi, somewhat because of specific functional requirements and based on a revealing interaction with the rest of the design team, it seems that Villanueva really had a very open and active relationship with all his engineers and the personnel at the construction. Villanueva subjects composition to technique. In so doing, he realizes the expressive power of structure as the maker of form, or rather, the meaning of form as essentially based on the purpose of structure. Unlike the referentiality legitimizing the beauty of formal choices in the hospital and rendering its style legible, the beauty of the stadium's formal choices lies on its self-referentiality, that is, on the unquestionable truth of its technique, as evidence in its material veracity. In a profoundly modern attitude, the stadium assumes aesthetics as a matter of ethics, for beauty is understood as just a manifestation of truth. And certainly, the direct correspondence between profile and loads, between masses and forces, turned this almost too evident structure into a particularly moving and distinctively intriguing pleasure. A series of structural ribs resting on almost incredibly light columns and beams support and cover the sitting areas of the main tribune as a delicate bird floating in the air. A system of ramps relates physically and formally this piece to the ground as topographical traces the building grows from. The general sitting area appears on the playing field as yet another topographical trace. This is it. As the geographical construction of an echo that opposes the gravity of the ground to the suspended lightness of the main tribune. This intensely poetic tension supports a spatial interaction that, while referred to the stable pattern of the playing field and contained in the concavity of the tiers, spans and reverberates in the active while serene interlocking of spaces. The infinite falling from the sky to the field through the steps of the sitting lines is captured by the floating hand of the tribune and brought back into the air through the thin line, open line of the ample roof, framed by structures only defined by the essence of their own truth. All these interactions occur without the mediation of style, to codify the experience, to guide its legibility or control its meaning, but through the plain evidence of the materiality of things and the transparent actuality of the technique making them to be. The expression of architecture, its meaning and purpose, has been liberated from the limitations of referential dependence and defined with the independent armature of self-referential constructive evidence. With the energy of this new creed and the accuracy of these new tools, Villanueva develops the fascinating experiments of the cover walks, with their folding planes, their oscillating surfaces, their primal quality, and their ability to integrate the attributes of a resting place to the dynamics of path. As the urban armature of campus, these corridors reverse the solid void pattern with streets constructed as buildings and buildings floating in the freedom of their garden lots. As architectural experiments, these pieces investigate on issues of materiality as both their physical and emotional impact, and in terms of the construction of the element and of the place the element constructs. Because besides and beyond the technical or compositional qualities of their structural explorations, these pieces propose a sense of form that substantially changes the visuality of the original master plan, one that would inform Villanueva's work for the rest of its process. These pieces are not built as objects to be seen, but as instruments from which, or better, through which, the work is more properly experienced. They are not realized as representation of the world or as presentations on it, but as artifacts to represent the world through the intense interaction with it. Instead of an arrangement of objects, architecture is now understood as a system of artifacts. Instead of contemplation, experience becomes the object of architectural work. Instead of an issue of delimitation, space is defined as one of relationships. The pivotal piece for this realization, its most significant example, the most relevant piece on campus, and likely the most important building in 20th century Latin American architecture, is Plaza Cubierta, covered plaza, and the buildings forming it, at the administrative and cultural center of Ciudad Universitaria de Caracas. This complex, comprising the administration building, the lecture hall, is the administration building. The lecture hall is somewhere here. The University Museum, the main auditorium, or Aula Magna, and the main library, was from the original master plan to articulate the medical area to the rest of campus. The different master plans options between 1933 and 1950 have the complex constructing the east facade of the trident, consolidating the west front of campus, neutrally mediating between the two or spreading its pieces to allow for the continuity between them, but always reinstating the symmetry of the plan. Suddenly, in 1951, as the design for this building starts, Villanueva turns the overall composition around and tries a cross-axial organization that would oppose the linear arrangement of these pieces, running west to east, to the main north-south axis of the original plan. This critical shift seems to delete the symmetry of the design to subtly recapture it through the inflections of masses and the punctuation of details, as if imposing on the existing text a sub-theme written on a different rhythm, joining the calm pace of the original pulsation in moments of concentrated significance. And by crossing the axis, the concentration around it and within the oval is exploded towards the surrounding space, acknowledging for the first time the presence of the hills and the expansion to the east as a fundamental condition of the site. As in an urban armature, masses and spaces are not dominated by the abstraction of axis and symmetry, but organized as an assemblage of situations through which experience is constructed through the realization of place. While compositionally evocative of Corbusier's proposal for the Palace of the Soviets from 1931, the massing of the complex does not emphasize its center or its edge, but interactively integrates spaces, masses, and paths through the permeable interstices between buildings and links them to the space around them. As a liquid spreading around volumetric gaps and formal inflections, space flows horizontally to set the order of place as an expansive impression, but declares its placing by vertically piercing that continuity with light and creating interactive territories that break apart while hold together the pieces forming them. In so doing, Villanueva certainly reformulated the principles with which pieces were related in the original master plan and had been in the previous buildings, incorporating, as commonly acknowledged and always repeated, the modern idea of flow in space. It is my contention, however, that the notions realized in these spaces transcend the conventional understanding of modern flow in space by constructing a physical and perceptual intertwining that aptly dissolves the legible entity of form into the perceivable realm of experience, transforming limits into links. If with Heidegger we define, and I quote, a boundary not as that at which something stops, but that from which something begins its presence in, end of quote, constructing the limit is constructing the systems of interaction through which the presence of the thing is linked to the world. A limit is the establishment of the outwardly links of the inwardly being that allows the presence of things to be revealed. The very realization of presence comes out from the variability of both limit, through which the specificity of the thing is stated, and link, through which the thing is connected to the thing supporting its being. But by exploring the tensions between the two, it also implies the experiential perception of all, and I quote, the invisible times and spaces contained in this of ours, as the painter asked the writer in Carlos Fuentes' novel Terra Nostra. Unlike referentiality, which validates experience by its dependence to previously codified creeds, or self-referentiality that validates experience in its own terms, presencing relies on both connection and independence, the ability of the thing to evoke experiences that would allow for its readability, as well as the autonomy of its own physicality and armature. The celebration of presence relies on the recuperation of the thing as part of the world, and of the world as expressed through the things forming it. By summarizing the multiplicity of experiential sources into the singularity of experience. In these terms, presence does not depend on manipulating images or even on defining forms, but on the articulation of experiential situations that, in the strong subtlety of its poetic intensity, break the barriers of artificial limits and deepens into the essence of fundamental links. The slide on your left is Villanueva's beach house. In this process, architectural form, as in Villanueva's own words, an enveloping haze that cuts space only where needed, becomes just an instrument for rendering the presence of the world and its things readable. No longer the arrangement of masses on a stage after a determined set of rules. Architecture becomes the organization of an environment aimed at the revelation of the deep structure of its order, the purposeful construction of limits and manifestations of links through which, in the words of Octavio Paz in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, and I quote, "The door of perception opens slightly, and the other time appears, the real time we had been seeking for without knowing it, the present, the presence." With the disciplinary rigor gained at the École des Beaux-Arts and the precise discrimination of his modern eye, Villanueva found the sources for these spatial interactions in local architecture. Knowing with T.S. Eliot that, and I quote, "tradition is a matter of very wide significance, which cannot be inherited, and that if you want it, you must obtain it with great labor," end of quote, Villanueva's search for the original seed allowed him to almost suddenly discover, and this is a quote from Octavio Paz again, that modernity is not outside, but within us. Plaza Cubierta and the buildings around it marked Villanueva's discovery of the tropics, or better instead, the architectural unveiling of the spatial opportunities of place towards its experiential intensification. The transformation of the construction of limits into the revelation of links proposes presence as the enactment of modernity, and this as the crucial return to the origins that could bring experience beyond the limitations of plain veracity and into the engaging uncertainties of deep truth. From the northwest, the complex is reached along a cantilever arch corridor that winds parallel to the hill as emerging from it, and lightly aligning on the bushes along the street. The twisting clock tower marks the entry and turn to Plaza del Rectorado through the museum wing, inflected to receive the flow of life as in Piazza San Marco, and originally lifted on pilotis to let space run continuously towards and from campus. The stark muteness of the administration building sets a silent monumentality only disturbed by the playfulness of a canopy, stating its centrality with a powerful profile and tightly compressing the spatial sequence. If coming from campus, you have to go up a small hill along a curved path that cinematically displays forms, hints, gaps, and spaces as a complex interrelationship of clues awaiting to be discovered. As an oscillating silhouette springs forward towards the garden and falls back into spaces of diverse but always bright luminosity, inhabited by the intriguing association of artworks, murals, built shapes, and a persistent rhythms of column getting into the temptingly shining shadow of the plaza. Like a puzzle piece, the sinuosity of the boundary assembles an engaging situation. Precise and agile, the edge stands out and dissolves, is drawn against the sky and fused together with the profile of changing lights, announces the vibrant presence awaiting the visitor, and looks over the presence of campus as a thrilled balcony. The subtle, almost feeble line outlining the roof and constructing its limit refers the expansive spaces concurring at it and builds through their opposition a realm of interaction that celebrates the moment of transition as an event in itself. Once you pass the threshold under the administrative building or along the curved canopy over campus, the potential symmetry of the axis is quickly erased, tilting the sequence and shifting the ceremoniality of the entrance into a game of multiple directions. Like an endless repetition of Corbusier's Maison Domino, columns and beams define a regular while rotated system of iterative lines setting an evident but still mysterious depth waiting to be discovered. The simplicity of the structural system is confronted by the intriguing multiplicity imprinted by rotation. The thrilling profiles of the roof openings, the colorful explosion of murals and vegetation, and the ever-changing shapes of the construction shadows on the shining floor. The austerity of the naked structure seems to render itself invisible, holding its physicality back and acting as just an experiential frame for the unveiling of space, while emphasizing rotation by the shifted opposition between the lines of the beams and the bands of the floor pattern. As if after Jorge Luis Borges' skeptically sarcastic definition of a system as, and I quote, nothing else than the subordination of all aspects of the universe to any single one of them. Villanueva himself had written in 1965, I'm not appealed by closed systems. I am interested in all contributions, the new forms and new meanings they all express. I reject the values of dogmatisms concerned only about delimiting, separating, discriminating, end of quote. The architect seems to erode the prevalence of any unavoidably deceiving system by constructing space through the interaction of multiple systems. In this effervescent mechanism, corners reinstate space, shadows reformulate centrality, columns outline the enactment of freedom, murals accentuate and dilute depth, while the intense columns of light break the roof flatness, constructing an alternative topography. The gardens here, there, Jean Arp's Klaus Scheppe, beyond it, the nook besides the lecture hall. To the right, the inflected yellow window of the Vasarely mural. There, a stress of light. Here, a patch of nature trapped in a place that offers itself as a moment, a pause in the everlasting passes of space and nature. Frailly, the concrete block lattices mediating between a background that comes forward and a foreground that dissolves in light. From here, the winding profile of the roof embraces Henri Laurent's Amphion, twisting as an anxious screw that could hold the buttresses behind, and expanding as an open hand towards the field underneath and beyond. Over there, the repetitiveness of these virtual rooms derives onto the fluid ascent of the ramps and the enigmatic continuity heading east. As the engaging hypostyle chamber of Plaza Cubierta turns into the smooth convexity of the Aula Magna vestibule, the floor rises as ramps, and the planes of the walking surfaces become the quiet, round balconies underneath the roof, floating over lattices and above the tight entrances to the auditorium. The feminine seduction of the ramps leads the visitor to the luminous and introspective continuity of Aula Magna. The ancestral immediacy of this splendid space captures the joyful accidentality of the preceding sequence, transforming it into a monumental solemnity of uterine order. As an archetypal cave, its surfaces fold and blend floors, walls, and ceilings in a spatial continuity that haptically wraps around you, enclosing while expanding a room so precise as the presence of light. Calder's clouds float as passing butterflies. The impressive purity of the balcony delicately descends on a room as a fine leaf separated from the shining shell. The structural ribs spanning over the whole with the transparent veracity of the stadium present the exterior as a massive mountain on an open field, while the effortless appearance of the interior seems to construct an even more open field for the reverberance of light and sound to develop. A delicate canopy wrapped around the mass hangs from the ribs and over the vestibule as the superimposed layering of trees in the forest. The inflection of the mass captures the axis coming from the hospital and twists towards one of the corridors and onto the westernmost edge of the tribune at the stadium, whose opposite end is almost precisely aligned with the original axis. Let me try to explain this if I can. The original axis is captured by Aula Magna and then shifted towards one side, and if you keep the original, then the stadium reinstates the original symmetry but kind of shifts it down based on the movement of Aula Magna. As an off-center central piece, Aula Magna composes the overall unity from the traces of its classical origin, beyond the evidence of a simplistic understanding, and as an instrument towards the realization of the subjacent order of experiential space. As a room, Aula Magna transforms its interiority into a revealing sense of externality. Those opposed to the internalization of exterior space along the repetitive frames of Plaza Cubierta. As a form, Aula Magna seems to synthesize the forces of the environment and those of its materiality without further mediation, and to develop its expressiveness from the stark correspondence between them. Typologically, Aula Magna belongs to the family of conventional symmetric halls, and the legibility of this belonging allows for the realization of its institutional monumentality, while the surprising and festive articulation of its pieces turns the experience into a joyful ritual of color, layering, expansion, and transparencies that brings the experience back to the intensely common delights of daily life. In its experience, Aula Magna transcends the distant satisfaction of its visual clues to inform a process in which all senses participate in the construction of an intensely somatic presence. In its physicality, everything in Aula Magna seems at once unavoidably certain and challengingly deceiving, obvious and at the same time inscrutable, comforting as the satisfaction of a transparent revelation, suggestive as the possibility behind a translucent veil, opaque as a still unanswered question. Outside, the winding ramps mark a portal towards the path to the main library. The shining lights and luminous shadows of another Basarelli points out the presence of the concert hall opposed to the luminous wall of perforated concrete blocks that every afternoon at sunset dissolve the solidity of columns and wash the bright pavement with radiant scales. As if prying into a side view, accepting an intruding light, deciphering the presence of the sky through the moving shadow on the floor, breathing the tight air compressed under the almost too low ceiling, or exploring the voids on which the geometrical shapes of the walls float. Distant spaces are invited into this place to support the compelling power of the presence it reveals when, as the floor turns into a liquid surface, what seems to be remembered becomes an object of desire. As one enters the main library, a stained glass mural by Fernand Léger thickens the air with light and color. A curved balcony mildly wraps the vertical transition leading to the narrow stairs going up to the main reading room. Recuperating the prevailing horizontal, this hall opens widely onto the main garden and through it onto the whole campus. The city and the mountain framing it. As if coming back to where everything comes from, the experiential circle is completed, and the intertwining presence of inspiring situations amidst dissolving forms is revealed as the supporting purpose of an instantaneous, simultaneous, permanent movement and reformulation in this or any other sequences. Always anew as the circumstances of the environment breathe through the order of architecture. While classical space distinctively opposes interior and exterior, elaborating on the limit between them, an orthodox modern space constructs a unifying continuity between the exterior and the interior realms through the erasure of that limit. These intertwined, intermingled, interlaced spaces do not oppose nor blend these spatial domains, but celebrate a presence born from their confrontation, growing its fullest enjoyment and the deepest revelation from the potential conflict of that encounter. With sinuosities, transparencies, cantilevers, and rigor, limits are not dissolved, but exacerbated, but not as a surface, but as a territory of exchange. In it, realms expand towards each other and interact with adolescent passion, building a presence evocative of those informing them. The presence of an aura that, in Walter Benjamin's words, become the appearance of a distance, however close it might be. In his article, Modernist Painting, Clement Greenberg states that, and I quote, "The essence of modernism lies on the use of the characteristic methods of the discipline to criticize the discipline itself, not to subvert it, but to define it more firmly in its fields of competence." End of quote. With a deeply modern attitude, these complex investigations on the experience of presence and the progressive transposition of image into substance, and for it, the transformation of physical limits into situational links, occur as the disciplinary limit is more precisely drawn, and as compositional operations are subordinated to seemingly obvious technical certainties. Actually visible and subjectively questionable elements are reduced to a minimum, and when there are some, they are presented as unavoidable, as sustained mainly in a functional and constructive logic. As architectural discourse appears reduced to purely functional construction and structural concerns, what appears as a self-imposed withholding of formal elaboration opens experience towards the realization of truth beyond simplistically visual appearances, supported on the unavoidable actuality of technical veracity. The image of buildings and spaces is just a frame to be transposed, questioned, and confronted, with the bristly sensitivity of a naked swimmer, as experiential opportunity inducing from their materiality and beyond their shape, the comprehensive enjoyment of the senses through the intensification of the dwelling process. One light, a shadow, a sparkle, a sieve, one beam, the strong marks on an almost clumsy casing, a pavement passing from polished smoothness to exuberant vegetation, those structural ribs sticking out, the distant mountains, the sun caressing shapes as an oscillating scale. These forms do not end in themselves, but propose a presence that, as a waving flag, announces those contained in their history and our hope. These are not enclosing limits, but permeable links that in their somatic visibility imprint and experience the intertwined traces of a world celebrating itself through the unity of its interdependent parts, environmental situations, material qualities, and textural variations. What is seen is just a sign of what is to be felt. And feeling is the first step towards the realization of the overwhelming joy of living in a particular time and place, the foundation of a reality for which architecture, unveiling its deep order, tries to find a form. In one of his lectures, Carlos Raul Villanueva once said, and I quote, "One would like to build an ideal form without anything useless, so logical and so pure that there would be no noticeable difference among roofs, walls, and natural space." Realizing the buildings at Ciudad Universitaria de Caracas and through the realization they supported, the implications of this quest were consistently explored and significantly imprinted in the experience of those places, along a persistent definition of disciplinary limits and the pertinent delimitation of architecture with mechanisms of spatial linking. As one walks these buildings and spaces, enjoys the serene transparencies of the School of Humanities on your right, breathes the atmospheric inflections of the School of Architecture on your left, School of Humanities from 1954, the School of Architecture from 1957. Enters the interactive transition of the School of Dentistry on your right from 1958, or deciphers the evocative luminosity of the School of Sanitary Engineering on your left from 1962, the process keeps unfolding its questions and possibilities and as an endless maze around and towards the construction of place. The journey along the evolution of the architect's mind, more than an anecdotal curiosity, stays with you as a challenging request. As a really good question, those rising from these spaces do not result in constraining answers, but in new, expanding, rewarding uncertainties. Experience thus turned into a continuous field of experimentation. By subverting the limits of space and converting them in experiential links, and by emphasizing the cultural links of architectural actions by means of a precise, almost obsessive delimitation of the disciplinary specificity, these spaces both celebrate and question the abstract permanence of the typical and the concrete pertinence of the topical, as an emotional instrument exploring that intriguing territory between ideas and facts we call life. The remarkable understanding and a precise execution of the physical, technical, and functional conditions of the intended product support the poetic ramifications of the place they construct towards a seemingly endless process in which life and those who live it are defined in terms of the permanence of change, and what should be is just what is in the process of becoming. Perhaps and simply because, and I end with this quote from Octavio Paz's Nobel Prize lecture, modernity is a word in search of its meaning. Thank you. I don't know what's the routine. I guess there might be some questions and perhaps someone to answer them.
That's very interesting. Given that you've assumed such a very rigid Beaux-Arts plan the university, knowing the nature of academic institutions, how did Villanueva persuade the university to change to something so different?
I can give you the formal answer to that, and I can also tell you what I suspect might be the answer.
Good.
The formal answer would be that there's a whole myth around that. That suddenly, well, as he was married to a very wealthy woman, and he kept his contacts in Europe, he was well aware of things going on in Europe, and very much concerned about being, updated. And that somehow he had some kind of a relationship with Corbusier. It seems that not as strong as he pretended, but he did have some relationship with Corbusier. There's also a gossip that Alvar Aalto went to Caracas 3 times without nobody noticing it in his way to different places, to Buenos Aires or to Rio or different places, and he was lucky enough because nobody recognized him. And he went there and made sketches of Plaza Cubierta, which, by the way, I would say is more of an Aalto space than a Corbusian space. And then as part of the myth, there was this, at the time, young Italian person, because he wasn't an architect at the time, Juan Pedro Posani, who started to work at Villanueva's office. And Villanueva, according to this myth, had somehow heard of Bruno Sevi's, how's the word, to learn how to see architecture. I'm translating, so I don't know how the book is called. And to know how to see architecture from Bruno Sevi, with his argument on organic architecture. But the book was written in Italian, and Villanueva didn't read Italian. So the myth has Posani translating the book for Villanueva, as Villanueva was working on his desk. Kind of a medieval dining room in a monastery. The word of God coming down to the master. So the myth would say, the official answer would be that suddenly in the 1950s he learns about organic space, gets in touch with modern architecture, and gets a revelation or something like that. My answer would be that a very sensitive person, but certainly not an intellectual, but very well trained for dealing with different styles, was able to understand the style of working without style. And to do it, I would say, very intuitively. Obviously, connected with things that were going on. And there's also another myth that there was a very strong influence from Brazilian architecture, which I think that's perhaps the most untrue, because the architecture of Niemeyer, for example, however striking it might be in terms of form, is composed very much in classical terms, as freestanding objects to be seen, beautiful objects, but objects, enclosed objects on an open field. So I hope there are no Brazilians in here, but I think the Villanueva's contribution is, you are Brazilian, sorry for that. I mean, sorry for what I'm going to say. I think Villanueva's contribution is far more important than Niemeyer's.
But that explains Villanueva's change, or various explanations. But how did he persuade the politicians of the university?
That's surprising, especially when you realize that the best buildings in Ciudad Universitaria were made during a dictatorship, and a pretty ferocious one. A dictatorship which, funnily, forced the construction of Aula Magna for inaugurating it for a festival on Latin American music, where the, how they call this wonderful arias by Villalobos were first played in Aula Magna. So it was, I guess you've seen Doña Flor and her two husbands, so you know that logic doesn't quite apply or logical logic doesn't quite apply for things in South America. But somehow, then this dictatorship did want to look as very progressive. And Villanueva, I guess it was a combination of the work he had done, the credibility of his family connections. He sounded as a credited way for gaining this credibility in terms of a progressive government, but still he wasn't regarded as revolutionary. So he did fit in it.
Well, I have some more, but it's somebody else's turn.
The kind of formal reading of the work was very, very clear, and I think really very interesting. But I think it would be helpful if you could mention a few words in terms of the more general context in which Villanueva finds himself. Can you say something about what else was going around, and what is his relationship to other kinds of architectures that are going on during the, let's say, 40s and 50s?
In Venezuela. Well, that gives me an opportunity to kind of promote a book that is upstairs on Venezuelan architecture in the 1950s that Ludwig told me that only he and Yacira had taken a look on it. The production of Venezuelan architecture in the 1950s is really amazing. It's a very interesting, somewhat complex, but at the end also very easy to understand process. It was a very wealthy country. It was the main oil supplier to the United States, to all the allies during the World War II. Venezuelan society has always been a very open society. It welcomed refugees from the wars. There was a big influx from people coming from Spain after the war in Spain. Big Jewish immigration after World War II, and basically a big European immigration after World War II. It was a great place to live. Everything was still to be done with a lot of money. So what else can you ask for? There was also another thing going on that in what I'm going to say changes what Villanueva did and what people in Villanueva's generation did. Villanueva and his colleagues came to France, basically, to the École des Beaux-Arts or l'École Polytechnique. But the younger generation, and I'm going to mention some names, Tomás José Sanabria, Martín Vegas, Julio Volante, Julián Ferris, they went to the United States. And there's also a big cultural change. The 19th century was looking after Europe and basically looking after France. But then the 20th century and the wealth is somehow understood as connected to the United States. So this new generation goes to the United States, gets a formal education as architects for the first time, and then they come back to Venezuela, and in 1952, Villanueva is able to create the School of Architecture, which was, until that time, a department from the engineering school. So there's this extraordinary conjunction of very good architects, young, very well connected, trained with Mies van der Rohe and Gropius and all these guys, coming back with the credibility, of coming from Harvard or schools like Harvard to a country that has a lot of money, and they found an architecture school. So they have control of the whole game. And the amount and quality of buildings during the 1950s is amazing and, to tell you the truth, somehow depressing when you compare that to what's happened afterwards. And what happens afterwards, to tell you the truth, even Villanueva has some responsibility in that. Because after the 1950s, there was, well, this process during the 1950s also had to do with the dictatorship. So the dictatorship is thrown out in 1958. The beginning of the 60s, there's a combination of good architecture and wealth somehow connected to the dictatorship. So the democracy is going to bring wealth for everyone, even if no one is as wealthy as they used to be. But that also affects architecture, because our good architecture is understood as a sign of some kind of corruption. And even Villanueva plays that game. For example, I mean, this building I was talking about, the School of Economics, suffers that. I mean, the idea that also has a lot to do with things that were going on in everywhere. The idea of social conscience as opposed to visual quality, the idea of mass production, architecture understood not in terms of pleasure, but in terms of just function, and in a very utilitarian, plainly utilitarian understanding. And that happens during the 1960s, and then surprisingly, these young guys who had founded the school under Villanueva and had created this amazing amount of very good work kind of disappeared. Some of them even retired from architecture. So the 1960s and very much the 1970s are kind of a void in Venezuelan architecture. But again, if you go to, it's called El Espíritu Moderno, the modern spirit, 1950, and check what was done in Venezuela in the 1950s, is really amazing. They have a somewhat stupid detail in that book, but I think it also tells a lot about the importance of Venezuela at the time, that the first store by Christian Dior outside from Paris was in Caracas, even before than New York. So that somehow tells you the importance of the country in the 1950s. And that importance was certainly expressed in architecture. As an extension of that, there's also, I thought there was a very deep reason for that. Now I believe it's completely accidental. Villanueva's big friend and also his professional enemy was Luis Malaucena, an architect with whom he had gone to school in Paris, with whom he had designed the Venezuelan pavilion for the fair in Paris in 1936, 37. The Venezuelan pavilion was right next to a Spanish pavilion where the Guernica was. And actually, Villanueva and Malaucena won the first prize at that fair with a neoclassical building. At about the same time that Villanueva starts designing Ciudad Universitaria, Malaucena is commissioned the military academy. And the military academy, which is a beautiful building, is a kind of a fascist building, very much like a Piacentini building. Very beautifully done, but substantially different from what Villanueva was doing in Ciudad Universitaria. At the beginning, as I was saying, I thought that there was a very good reason for that, that the choice of architects was something that had been planned for having this fascist thing at the military academy and having this flamboyant modern thing as a symbol of culture. It seems that it was absolutely accidental, so we might have ended up having a modern military academy and a fascist university.
Did he meet Sir during this period? Is there any
Yes,
record?
yes, they were pretty good friends. They were pretty good friends, and actually Sir did a couple of projects in Venezuela because of Villanueva. And Villanueva got some special award from Harvard, some special medal or something. They were pretty good friends. They had met in Paris, and
Sir did the pavilion.
yeah, because Sir had made the Spanish pavilion, and I don't recall the exact story, but from there they became good friends, and Villanueva somehow helped Sir for coming to America, or for going to America.
To what extent the architects which had learned to be working in the 1950s in Caracas were aware of doing something which was unusual in European terms or indeed in any other terms, and if they felt that they were doing something unusual, what would you say were some major issues which were being discussed? Because looking at it, say, from a French point of view, it is not at all obvious, because the artists which one sees have been Arneche, Laurence, and Patarani, which instantly makes one feel and colder, makes one feel that this work was very much in the mainstream of modernism as it was taking place in Europe at that time.
Yeah, which was not the case in Venezuela. I mean, you have to put yourself in that context, and the idea of progress, which was thriving the whole thing. There was a very conscious decision to break with tradition, even at the expense of demolishing buildings which were considered of value, about which one has to say Villanueva was always pretty conscious. I mean, he had a public argument against the demolition of a very famous house for opening an avenue. But basically during the 1950s, the whole idea was to make a new country, and everything that looked or reminded you of the past was undesirable precisely because of that. So there was a very strong decision to make something completely anew. There was a passion, for example, with highways, the possibility of getting further and further away, an excitement with the new possibilities of the car, for example. One of the most amazing buildings from the times, which is still unfinished, is called the helicoide. I don't know how to translate that. It's a helicoid, like which is actually a street that goes up around a hill. Somehow. Exactly. But it comes up and down in between the gaps. And it's actually, it looks like a big bulk, like a pyramid or a mastaba, really. But it's actually very thin because it's just a street with a strip of retail spaces. But the whole idea was, that you almost like drive-in boutiques. And then all the excitement of the car, all the excitement of new materials, the excitement of big scales. Caracas was a very small town. I mean, at the beginning of the century, Caracas was less than 1,000 people. In 1920, it reached 100,000. And right now, is more than 4 million. And by the 1950s, it was already 2 million. So in 40 years, it jumped from 100,000 to 2 million. And obviously, that has every kind of consequences. But at the time, even the problems were looked as wonderful opportunities. I mean, we'll have the time and we'll have the money. Right now, we don't. But at the time, they thought we would ever will. especially when compared to the rest of Latin America. I mean, what Gloria is saying is that, and that's also a very peculiar characteristic of Venezuelan society. The Venezuelan elite has not been conservative in visual terms, at least to the extent that the Argentinian elite or the Colombian elite or the Mexican elite have been. In fact, for example, right now, the biggest and most complete collection on Morandi, private collection on Morandi, is in Caracas, which is no longer? Is already in Switzerland? They're selling it. Wow. No, and I was telling Gloria the other day the story as, yeah, I don't know if I'll recuperate. But for example, as an example of what the elite was at that time, when I was going to say when you go, I guess when you went to that house for visiting that collection, you go there basically because you want to see the Morandis, right? And then you get to, every room has, or had, 5, 6 Morandis, and then you get into the room watching at the Morandis because in the back is the stuff that doesn't count as much, you know, the Braques and the Picassos and the De Quiricos, because that's not the big part of the collection. But that's there, I guess, I hope. Gio Ponti made 3 or 4 houses in Caracas at the time. Richard Neutron made a house in Caracas. I was telling this morning in a review I just stopped by, the golf courses of one of the fanciest clubs in town were designed in the office of Olmsted. So, you know, it's like a big collection of things going on. Again, pretty unusual in absolute terms, and absolutely unusual within the Latin American context.
The main reason is the oil economy.
The economy? Yeah, but I mean, yeah, but the Argentinian economy was even stronger before the World War II, and they didn't buy, you know, they were very conservative. So there obviously there was a lot of money. I mean, they didn't buy the Morandis by the catalog, but they did have the eyes for choosing Morandi, for example, and not going, by the way, as some other people did, after the Rubens or something, you know, more established.
Most of the attributes we have of the kind that are usually read or derived from the finished work, from the completed projects. And they are, for the most part, too complex and too vague to be the conceptual basis of design. We know this as designers. Are there any records of how Villanueva was thinking himself at the time?
Well, we are still lucky because Juan Pedro Posani still lives, and now he's talking. And Juan Pedro was perhaps Villanueva's first assistant as such. And his last assistant was Gorka Ronsoro. And when we were preparing the material for the show, the school, we organized kind of a small seminar inviting people. And we invited them both for a session. And it was a delightful session, you know, them gossiping about Villanueva. And well, Gorka, for example, was saying that he was always scared, you know, the final day when Villanueva would come for signing the final plans. Because more than once, he went there and said, perhaps it shouldn't be that tall. Why don't we check it? Now, with everything absolutely ready, all the calculations and everything ready. He worked very fast. So he would produce buildings, complete projects in 2 months. So he didn't mind starting all over again. So the whole idea of campus as an experiment was very much lived by him. And there are some buildings, well, I told the story that I'm pretty skeptical about that now after 14 years, but I might start the project for the law school next month. And that's one of the buildings. It's not on campus because actually the university was in downtown. And when they decided to make the new campus, they kept the law school downtown. But then, you know, the people from the law school started complaining, well, we should be on campus, we should be on campus. And there was no place, no location, because it hadn't been planned from the beginning. And Villanueva would use the need of the law school as an excuse for getting rid of buildings he didn't like. He didn't like the dormitories, for example. And it seems that anytime anybody said that there was a need for some building, he would say, why don't we put it here? Let's turn down these buildings. So he really took the whole plan as an experiment, and he was very much aware of things that hadn't come out you know, the way he wanted. And as I was saying, I mean, he wouldn't consider it too much to start all over again if at the end he wasn't pleased. So he did enjoy the process of experimentation. It seems he was a very joyful person. There's also a story told by Gorka, the engineer who made the calculations for Aula Magna, was a German engineer who praised himself of having learned structures by demolishing bridges during the war, because he was given a certain amount of dynamite, and he had to administer the dynamite. And then it seems that he said that, you know, by learning how to demolish something, you learn where the weak places are, which is the same as knowing where the strength is. And it seems, you know, from Gorka's story is a story from a meeting between this engineer, Villanueva, and Calder. They were all, you know, short, chunky, fat guys. And it seems this engineer was, you know, an outstanding person, you know, very well-rounded. And Gorka was there, you know, taking notes of the meeting. And, you know, these three guys were talking, you know, up there, you know, about every kind of very profound considerations. And then one of them said something that the other one didn't like. And then this person would take a piece of paper and throw it to the other one. And they started a paper fight for 5 minutes, jumping on chairs and tables as three kids. And then suddenly, okay, we're ready. I sat down and recuperated the very elevated level of the conversation. So it seems that he was able to play in all those levels, you know, to basically to enjoy the work, which I think is something you feel when you go there.
I know I'm running the risk of developing this into a dialogue rather than question and answer, but there's just one thing I wanted to clarify. Well, we all know there was a time when there were people who believed that a building should reflect the socio-economical, political, and technical conditions of its time. And many people believed that, but an intelligent designer knew that this was too complex, hideously complex problem to aim a design project at. He had a much more simple approach, I think. But many people believe this. Now, so this is what I really mean, that, you know, when I ask, are there any records of how he was actually thinking as opposed to what people read from his work?
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps these are points that clarify. I mean, if there are any records that might clarify, these are of real value to know how he was.
Yes. From his writing during the time he was doing the buildings I showed today, he was very much, as you were saying, suspicious about people who pretended architecture having any other purpose than specifically architectural. during the 1970s, he completely changed and became a major factor in what was called the renovación, the renovation of the architecture school. And, with all those discourses from the 1970s about social responsibility and architecture being a social profession and having to do primarily with social, economical, political issues, and then using design as an instrument for acting with social, political, economical issues. So there was a change. I can only say that that change also shows in his architecture.
Take a couple more questions, and if you want to ask something more, we can continue the conversation upstairs. Can maybe the lady behind you?
Yes.
Thank you. Hi, I would like to ask if there's something being made at the moment to preserve the architecture from the 90s, 50s. The ones who have lived in Venezuela, we all know that, our neighbors sell their house and they build, a 20-floor building. And, these very nice houses from the 90s, 50s are being knocked down. So which ones are going to be preserved? Are they going to be preserved? And as well about the recuperation of the helicoide, is that going to happen someday? The helicoide is the Plagatox building that we were talking before.
Well, let's start with the last, and then we get rid of the bad news. The helicoide is now being used by the intelligence office. Okay. What you're saying is one of the, certainly perhaps the most terrible problem in Venezuelan cities right now. The good news about that is that Ciudad Universitaria has a plan for preserving it. In fact, you are benefiting from it somehow because the plans you have upstairs were produced by an office from Central University who is putting together all the information about these buildings for asking for some special program at UNESCO for declaring Ciudad Universitaria, how is it called? Universal World Heritage. So, although I understand UNESCO hasn't answered yet, the process has risen some consciousness about it. And although I'm afraid that this year, at the end of the year, this year, someone will ask that Carlos Raul Villanueva should become a saint, because this is Villanueva's centennial. So there are exhibits everywhere. There are articles in every paper. There's a wonderful book. I also brought a copy that is going to be in the library. There's a great show. If you go to Venezuela before July, there's a great show at the National Gallery. There's going to be another show afterwards on his art collection, which is amazing. He basically has all the sketches for the artists, from the artists who worked in Ciudad Universitaria, and also a lot of gifts given by friends he knew in the process or knew along the process, and that's going to be shown at the Contemporary Art Museum. There's going to be a show also on his academic notes, which are amazing from the theory classes he taught at the School of Architecture. That's going to be at the School of Architecture. Actually, that might be the week after next, because his birthday is on May 30th. We have elections of May 28th, so we might have fireworks anyhow. After that, there's going to be another show on his relationship with the artists in the Plaza Cubierta. That's going to be in the Fine Arts Museum. So, as I was saying, at the end of this year, someone's going to ask for him to become a saint. But that, which I think is awful, at the end might perhaps help to preserve Ciudad Universitaria. That's great. But then on the other hand, there's a terrible threat on the architecture from the 1950s. The day I was coming here, on the paper there was a kind of a terrible announcement, if you've been to Caracas, the Hotel Avila, which is a very nice, simple building designed by someone who also worked in the design of Rockefeller Center. It's been turned down. And well, I mean, every week there's a new, terrible news on some of these buildings. Also because, I mean, this illusion with progress is very much still alive. So in a country that has moved this fast, a building that is 30 years old is an antique. Too complicated for answering without wine.
Well, for where we are now, it was more to do with your theory of what you raised in the lecture. But
Yeah, we need wine for that.
Okay, so thank you for coming. And, have a good night.
Thank you.